Welcome to tonight's event, More Work, Fewer Babies. And this is sponsored tonight by the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America, which is the nation's leading academic institute dedicated to the scientific study of human flourishing in light of Catholic social doctrine. We're also grateful for the support of the Institute for Family Studies and for Plow Quarterly, which has a new issue out called What Are Families For? That has a lot of material that bears on the topics being discussed tonight. And tonight we've got two speakers joining us for this conversation on fertility across the globe. We have Dr. Lori DeRose, who's a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, a professor of sociology at Catholic University, and the director of the World Family Map Project. We also have Lyman Stone, who's a research fellow at the Institute for Family Studies and an adjunct fellow at the American Enterprise Institute as our second speaker this evening. Now, in terms of the Q&A, I just wanted to let you know, please submit your questions to the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll transition to Q&A around 7:10 this evening. As many of you may know, The Children of Men is set in this year, in 2021. P.D. James' novel powerfully and presciently depicts a world where women can no longer have children. Now, we're obviously not at the Children of Men state, but there is no doubt that 2021 will be bringing record lows in childbearing in countries across the globe. In fact, even before COVID, many countries reported record low fertility rates. The total fertility rate in the United States, for instance, hit 1.65 last year, a record. It hit 1.4 in Finland across the Atlantic, also a record. And then across the Pacific in South Korea, fertility went to 0.84 babies per woman on average there in South Korea. Both a record in South Korea, and I think probably across the globe as well. So what's going on here? Why is fertility dropping across so many countries around the world? And why is fertility falling even in the Nordics, which have excellent work-family policies and until recently had fertility rates that were close to replacement level? These are the kinds of questions that Lori DeRose and Lyman Stone will be taking up this evening as they present their new report, More Work, Fewer Babies. And with that, I turn over our virtual stage to Dr. Lori DeRose.
Hello, and thank you. What we're doing with this work, More Work, Fewer Babies, is basically just adding a piece to our understanding of the low fertility puzzle. And we believe it's a very important piece, as we're going to argue when we show you our evidence. But first, let me just let you know where the field has been up to this point. These are not the only low fertility theories by any stretch of the imagination, but scholars have noted a gap between countries that are more gender egalitarian and typically have public supports for work-family balance, and countries that are generally more gender traditional and where child rearing is handled more privately. And there's very little in the middle. These are the lowest fertility countries. Obviously, Brad was just mentioning some fertility rates even lower than 1 here. But the ones that come closer to 2 are on this other side of this so-called fertility fork. So this is, the idea here is that we may be reaching closer to replacement fertility, closer to a total fertility rate of 2.1 as we move from one part of the gender revolution to the other. The two-part gender revolution says, yes, women became active in the workforce, but the second half of the gender revolution, men really leaning in on the home front, is going to bring us back to a more sustainable fertility. These two leading theories are both ones that we add something to with our Workism project here. So again, the two-part gender revolution assumes that fertility came down in part 1 when women were joining men in the public sphere, but can rebound we call it fertility recovery in the field, when men are leaning in at home. And low fertility during the lag, when women commonly bear a second shift. So ideally, according to these scholars, these countries haven't finished the gender revolution to the same extent that these countries have, and they'll come back up in the future because of more private sphere equality, less of the second shift. The second shift is Arlie Hochschild's very well-known description of dual career couples working 40 hours a week, both of them, and then coming home, and women disproportionately taking care of domestic responsibilities, both housework and childcare. The other leading theory for low fertility theory says that low fertility is going to be persistent. The second demographic transition theory puts a lot of emphasis on post-materialism, people having aspirations other than things, and expressive individualism, and basically thinks that with all the family diversity that comes with the second demographic transition, cohabitation, out of wedlock childbearing, but it's not intended to be a negative description. It's intended to be a diverse description, that all of these different family forms are much more conducive to individualism and less to family per se, and low fertility is going to be persistent. Now, again, we feel like we're adding to both of these theories, because what's missing with the two-part gender revolution theory is that as men lean in more on the home front, they're going to face the same work-life balance issues that women already do. It's not like sharing the second shift makes the second shift go away, or even more importantly, for the purposes of our work, makes the first shift go away. The first shift still can be a priority in people's lives. And so this next bullet point is straight out of the report. It says that gender equality that primarily rests on the normativity of career-mindedness. The normativity of career-mindedness. I wish I knew where that was to turn it off. There we go. that can have unintended consequences, including low fertility. And that fully egalitarian couples may express their commitment to one another by supporting each other's public sphere success. That a couple may be more about supporting each other's public sphere success than supporting their joint private sphere success, which may or may not include children, but we argue is much less likely to include children than when the family isn't as workist or work-oriented. Now, on the second demographic transition side, what's missing is that the theory fails to specify which expressive norms drive low fertility. And we raise the question of, does self-actualization have to be at odds with childbearing? Or alternatively stated, as you see it there on the slide, couldn't individuals find their personal expression through an identity as parents? So we're basically saying that both people's identity as workers and their identity as parents matters. Okay, so what's happening? The Nordic countries are the ones that I'm showing in this slide for the particular reason that they're the countries that are supposed to be the most resistant to low fertility, the ones that should hang out above that 1.6 and the fertility fork that I showed you earlier. But since 2010-ish, we've had significant fertility decline in these countries with high rates of gender egalitarianism and lots of public support for work-family balance. So that's what's happened in the Nordics. So we introduced these particular expressive norms, workism and familism, as a way of potentially understanding what's going on with low fertility, or again, contributing to our understanding of what's going on with low fertility. So workism is when work has a very high place in people's values. When work is a place of socialization, friendship, public service, and status, it can have more than a materialistic kind of value. It can also have a moral and even ideological value, where self-expression is through work. Expressive individualism is as a career individual. And of course, by parallel, family can be a key source of meaning and value of life. So by familism, we're talking about, again, the social, moral, and ideological place of family in the life course. And we introduced the concept of networkism as the difference between the two, because most countries are, in fact, more familist than they are workist. In fact, I think maybe all, but not to the same degree. That if you take a country's average levels of workism, and Lyman will talk later much more about how that's measured, and it turns out it's not that crucial how it's measured. It's a pretty robust concept. But if you take the average levels of workism and you subtract the average levels of familism, that difference is very predictive in terms of fertility rates. And here's what it looks like for the Nordics. When I say they partly explain Nordic patterns, that's workism and familism, because what we've got here is net workism. Oh no, I'm sorry, this one is just workism. So the average change in work importance. We show elsewhere that net workism is driven primarily by the work part, that there's less variability in the familism part. But Denmark is the only country that had an increase in fertility between the last two survey rounds in the World Values Survey and the European Values Survey that we used. And its decrease in fertility was the least. No, not the only one that increased. Iceland did it a teeny bit. Basically what you see here is an imperfect correlation. That although if you array these countries in terms of their change in work importance, you don't get a perfect linear relationship with change in the fertility rate. It is kind of suspicious that the two ends fall out in the right place, and that even Netherlands and Sweden seem partially explained by this concept. This is simply a descriptive analysis. We went on from here to say, okay, what does it look like outside of the Nordics, across all the countries where we have fertility data and workism and familism data from either the World Values Survey or the European Values Survey. And we found that networkism mattered worldwide. And this graph is a little bit complicated just because it's showing an interaction term, but hang with me, it's not that bad. The change in the total fertility rate associated with networkism is actually positive in poorer countries where human development is at levels like 0.4 on an index that runs from 0 all the way to 1. So these are countries where work has material value, where it is crucial to supporting a family and to supporting an individual and for sustenance and survival. And so it's not surprising that when you ask people the very basic question of how important is work in your life, they say very important. We argue that when folks in Finland and Denmark and Sweden and at very high levels of human development answer the same question, that they may be answering more about these post-materialist values in terms of work having a meaning for someone's core identity. If you say, how important is work in your life? You're not asking just, does work allow you to live? You're also asking a broader question. So in the middle here, at human development levels, you have very little effective workism. A 0 means that workism isn't changing fertility at all. Here, a high value of work's contributing to fertility, and then very significantly at the highest levels of human development. And these are your wealthy countries. In fact, high HDI is defined as 0.8 and higher. And once you're at 0.85 or higher, you see a significant decline in fertility associated with more networkism. So we're at 0.2 of a child here, which may not sound like a lot, but it is a lot when it's 10% of replacement fertility. Okay, Lyman?
Let me share my screen here. So what I'll be talking about is we have this theory that workism, attitudes towards work, are going to influence fertility. And we have a pretty good demonstration of it in essentially one very big data set, right? The World Value Survey or the IVS survey program We have about 350,000 respondents from 90 countries across anywhere from 1 to, I think, 8 waves. So that's this very large international data set with good, clean questions about importance of family and work. So that's our primary test. But we wanted to see if workism is really real. Do our results extend to other contexts? That is, if we try to identify workism in a different survey, in a different data source, does it have the same associations? So we've done it with World Values Survey or European Values Survey. We wanted to replicate in other data sets, so we turned to the logical places, the International Social Survey Program, which has a couple of dozen countries across several waves. A survey called the Global Family and Gender Survey only has one wave. It's got about a dozen countries, but it has an extensive battery of questions related to these issues. It was run by, it was run in partnership with IFS a few years ago. And then also we have a survey of US women, the Demographic Intelligence for Fertility Survey, that we were able to design questions for once we'd already begun our research. That is, we could directly test our thesis in a survey of US women. So for the International Survey Program, we don't have fertility outcomes at the individual level, but we do have fertility preferences. So we can identify if workism is associated with fertility preferences. Again, we don't have generalized importance of work and family. So instead, we take attitudes like both spouses should work or married people are happier. For the Global Family and Gender Survey, we do have generalized importance of work. We don't have it for family, so we choose to use having a good marriage. We choose not to use things like being a good parent because being a good parent is endogenous to having children. People who have kids are more likely to say, it's important that I be a good parent. In the GFGS, we have both actual and intended total fertility, so we can test both sides. And then in the Demographic Intelligence Fertility Survey, we have a rank order of family and meaningful career and about 8 other things, where we basically give respondents a bunch of stuff and we ask them to rank the importance of it, and then we can look at a very broad spectrum of fertility outcomes. So the first thing we wanted to know is, are these measures correlated across countries? So what I'm showing here is the red dots are workism measured in the IVS surveys. The blue dots are workism measured in the ISSP surveys. And then the x-axis is workism measured in GFGS. So we have 3 surveys ultimately being shown here. And the point I want to make is that the results in GFGS positively correlate with country-level workist shares in the other 2 survey rounds. Then we want to know, well, are ISSP and IVS, are they correlated? So we can look at this across the 4 waves of ISSP that we have data for, and we can see that they are correlated. In each wave, countries that appear in both survey rounds do in fact have correlated, positively correlated workist shares. Now the exact levels are different because we're asking slightly different questions. But when we define workism as we do in our various models, this all turns out to be correlated, particularly in the more recent survey waves, which is to say, we can measure workism different ways, we can use different survey questions, and it's going to give us pretty similar results. Our results are not very sensitive to the exact way that you measure workism. They're pretty flexible. So workism is real. It's a real thing. You can measure it different ways. How you measure it, you're still going to get essentially the same rank order of countries by which places are workist and which ones are not. But does it predict low fertility? So here we can start with the ISSP data. Again, here we're predicting for family ideals, their ideal family size, not actual outcomes. But fertility preferences are extremely strongly correlated with fertility outcomes at the individual and the country level. So that's not a terrible shortcoming. And what we can see, the bars on the left are the most workist people, and the bars on the right are the most non-workist or the least workist people. And then the teal bar is the most familist people within each group, and the red bar is the least familist within each group. And what we can see is that within groups of familist ideas, so this is how people, in this case, how people feel about whether marriage makes people happy, being more workist is associated with lower fertility across all groups. The effect is strongest among the most familist groups, but it's there for all groups, which is to say, even controlling for people's generalized ideas about family, it turns out that workism predicts lower fertility preferences. The more people the more people think that work is very important for both spouses, smaller a family size they desire, even when you control for their generalized views about, say, marriage. Workism matters for fertility preferences. Then we have GFGS. We have a lot more graphs than this in the appendix to the report, but here I looked at total intended fertility, so children already had and children not yet had. The red line shows all women. As you move to the right on the graph, you're getting more workist, less familist, so net workism. And what you can see is that the effects aren't huge necessarily, and they're quite noisy. Or sorry, I should say the effects are large, but they are quite noisy. But by the time you get to the most workist people, you do have a significant negative effect of net workism. That is, the most workist people intend to have, by the time they're done having children, about half a child less than the least workist women. That's women over here, my reference category, so I don't have the bars shown. We can also look at childless women under 30. This is an interesting group because this is a way of saying just kind of the pure intentions, people who haven't even begun their childbearing yet. And we see that, yes, there is this negative trend in workism. And here I have controls for country and educational attainment, things like that, as I did in the previous one as well. Now, GFGS is a smaller survey with a lot fewer respondents, so it's not going to be as statistically significant. But it's reassuring that we see the same general effect. Then we turn to the DI fertility survey, or the DI family survey. And here we have personal ideas, so how many people's desires for their own family, their general ideals, that is, how many children do they think someone generally should have, their personal intentions, and their actual births. And what we can see, and we have a lot of granularity, so we actually rank people on their more familist or more workist on an 18-point scale based on where they ranked these two categories. What we can see is most people are over here on the more familist side. Most people are on net, at least a little bit familist. But what we can see is that as you go from more familist to more workist, all measures of fertility tend to decline. Actual births decline, intended total births decline, general ideals decline, personal ideals decline. It doesn't matter how you measure fertility outcomes, fertility preferences, whatever. By all measures, more workist people have lower fertility. Now, in a follow-up regression where I test this with a bunch of controls for demographics, the effect only gets stronger. So in the ISSP, more workism yields lower fertility ideals. In the GFGS, more workism yields lower intended total fertility and more delayed fertility. In diffs, more workism yields lower intended ideal and actual fertility. So that is a pretty strong robustness test. So what does this mean? It means more workism yields a lower fertility. But what this means for policymakers is that pronatal policies that operate through work might have challenges. Easing work-life balance is pronatal. You give people more parental leave, or you give them more childcare, freely provided. Easing work-life balance for working parents is clearly pronatal. But if it increases the social emphasis on work, if it communicates to people that work is necessary for a meaningful or for a socially prestigious life, it may be antinatal. It may, in fact, compete with the family. In fact, the most likely thing that would interrupt me from this call is if my 14-month-old were to wander in. What have I done? I've secluded myself from my family, right? And this is funny, but in this year, I think we can all see as people are working from home, what competes with family is work. Just down to brass tacks, what competes with family is work. And that's what we're showing here, is that there is actually a real trade-off between the values and the time ultimately that we give to work, and the values and the time that we assign to family. Now, this is contrary to some recent work. In particular, there was a paper put out just last year that reviewed a very large amount of policy-related research and suggested that pronatal policies are most effective when they are most accommodating to work. So they suggested things like childcare were most essential for achieving higher birth rates. But we think that work-focused pronatal policies like parental leave and free childcare may be less effective than work-independent policies like child allowances. And we can demonstrate that as well. This is not in the report. This is from a paper I published a few years ago, or a report that I published a few years ago. And this is essentially a review of 42 empirical studies of pronatal policies. And I've grouped them by cash benefits, childcare, leave, and then other, which is some usual policies. And what you can see is that while childcare, leave, and cash benefits all boost fertility, cash benefits do it by the most. And here I've equilibrated for the cost of the program, the economic size of the program, and the percent change in fertility. Which is to say, if you give benefits intended to increase fertility, but you tie them to work, you may get a smaller effect. One of the reasons there may be a smaller effect is because doing so plays into and reinforces this highly workist life script. So with that, I think we're done with telling you all what we told you in the report, and we can go into the discussion.
Great, thank you, Lyman, and thank you, Lori, for your presentation. Got a number of really, I think, incisive questions to send your way. The first one is that, according to some, young adults have been taught to value career over family and probably wait too long to get married and have children. Is this a reversible trend? We saw, for instance, recently Pew data telling us that a lot of young adults think that work is more fulfilling than both having kids and getting married, which would be kind of consistent with this question. So what's your thought about kind of reversing this mentality among young adults today?
You or me, Lyman?
I'm happy to take a first crack at it. Young college educated women have been sort of taught workism. I'm not 100% sure that well, okay. What we see is that there has been a modest increase in workist values in high income countries in recent years. There's a lot of qualifiers on that statement.
Oh yeah.
Modest increase, recent years, high income countries. That is to say, that does not fit with a story where women's entrance into the workforce and higher education is necessarily tied to workist values. Yeah. It is not the case that in everywhere that we see rising educational attainment and rising women's labor force participation, that people become workist generally. In fact, a lot of our trend is not driven even by changes in female attitudes. If you break it out by men and women, the effects for men are just as big. Workist men have as big of a penalty as workist women. And in fact, in some of our robustness tests, they have bigger ones. So I wouldn't restrict this. We're not just talking about women's attitudes towards work. Men who decide that 60 hours at the office is more important than wheels on the bus with their kids are also going to have fewer of them.
I appreciate the question a lot just because it highlights that it is difficult if marriage and family are delayed for them to have the same place in an individual's life than when they come first. And there's a success sequence that you and Wendy Wong have written about, Brad, that says that if you finish your education and get a job and get married and have kids in that order, that it's generally conducive to prosperity. And I'm not arguing with that. I'm just saying that the way that that plays out in a lot of developed countries is very delayed marriage. And that can make consumer aspirations, it can whet your appetite for the finer things that you can afford when you're single, that paying for diapers does interfere with. So I would come down on the side of it being a difficult trend to reverse. I appreciate Lyman emphasizing that it's not progress that we're talking about, that, oh my gosh, if we have educated women and we have good jobs, then we're all in trouble. No, that's not the story that we're telling. It's just the ideological place of work. I mean, it doesn't have to be on the throne. And I do think that that is a kind of subtle finding, because unlike the two-part gender revolution theory, where we're talking about hours of housework, you know, are men supporting women's second shift? We're talking about a structural change from separate spheres to overlapping spheres for men and women. This is more ideological in the spirit of the second demographic transition kind of writing, as we're saying, people's values matter. So then when we get a really insightful question like, can values change? The answer is, of course, but not on a dime. Values change slowly. Generally.
And we don't always know what changes them.
Yeah.
You know, if you were to say, how do we get people to be less workist? We have some speculative ideas about how to do that, but like, how do you get people to be less workist? How do you convince people to, you know, get up from the office and go home, and or not just go home, but go home and reserve the best part of their brain for what's going to happen when they get there?
Yeah.
How do you do that? I mean, I'm not good at that. So I mean, I don't think there's a clear like policy fix for that yet. Maybe there is, and I don't know about it. I'm not sure.
But it is an ideological issue. I mean, Lyman and I have been working together in this from a distance, and occasionally we've referred to not just workism, but an idolatry of work, and an idolatry of family can be a problem too. It's just not a problem for fertility the way that an idolatry of family is, but it's still lifting up something to a place of preeminent importance.
I'd also mention, and this isn't in the paper, but it's so many robustness tests that get cut on the cutting room floor. But in the DIFS survey of US women, where we got to basically design a survey to test our theory, we asked people not just how important is a meaningful career, how important is having a good standard of living or buying nice things. Like we just straight up asked people that. And having a good standard of living is not, that people saying it's really important to have a good standard of living is not correlated with lower fertility.
Oh,
it's the
wow.
meaningful career. It's saying, oh, I want to be comfortable. People want to have a good standard of living to provide for their children. That's kind of that thing that we observe in lower HDI countries as well. It's the meaningful career that does it.
On the cultural side of the, sort of the ledger here, so to speak, another question kind of wants us to think about whether or not workism is really a central issue, or is it that younger adults are concerned about how their kids or potential kids would affect the environment. So I know, Lyman, you've done some testing on this in some of your surveys. What is sort of in this sort of larger society, how much does kind of a concern about the environment really affect people's fertility versus, a concern, say, with, finding meaningful work and pursuing, that ideal job, so to speak?
I could say I've had 2 surveys in the field in the last year that explicitly asked reproductive age women in the United States about the extent of their worries about climate change, and allowed us to connect that to fertility preferences. It's not significant. People who are worried about climate change do not have lower fertility and do not have lower fertility preferences than other people when you control for basic demographics. People who are worried about overpopulation, they do have lower fertility preferences, but those are not the same group of people. You got about 25% of the overpopulation folks who aren't worried about climate change, which is a weird mix. And then you got about half the climate change people who aren't worried about overpopulation. And it turns out that the overpopulation people are worried about fertility, and the climate change people, a woman who says, yeah, I'm worried about climate change, is just not likely to actually have lower actual or desired fertility in the surveys I've run. Though I have another one in the field right now that asks about this as well. So we'll see.
I'll give an answer to that one without a representative sample. My students at the Catholic University of America this semester, by and large, not to a fault at all, believe in technological fixes to population problems, whether they're problems of food supply or environmental change. I don't want to paint them as being, pie in the sky kind of folks. They look at the record of our successful adaptations in the past, and they know, because they're taking my population class, that fertility is going down worldwide. Yes, it's still high in sub-Saharan Africa, but there are very few other places in the global south, but one is the continent of India that has like 2.2, 2.3-ish children per woman, where the population growth is substantial. It's almost like at least some people have realized that we don't need to be worried about overpopulation as the only population question of concern anymore. That the other question is, how are we going to take care of elderly generations? And I don't want to wave my arms and say, oh, we don't need to worry about overpopulation, but I can tell you, as someone who's been teaching introductory population for 30-ish years now, that concerns have changed. They have changed a lot. And one of the underlying themes in the shifting of concerns has to do with the fact that we've sort of diffused. Well, I shouldn't say diffused. The population bomb is not diffused. But one of the articles, again, that I assigned my class is 50 years of extraordinary demographic history by David Lamb. He says how the world, what's it called? How the world something the population.
I think my professor assigned the exact same article.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember his verb. It wasn't survived. How the world survived the population bomb. And so we have. And again, I don't want to be misunderstood as saying, oh, we never have to worry about climate change. But in response to the direct question that Brad was relaying, it's climate change is viewed as more as an issue of affluence and of maldistribution of wealth, where there are some people living with a huge carbon footprint compared to others, and it's viewed less through the neo-Malthusian lens of, oh, more people means we're going to hell.
I can put some representative data to that too. The Monitoring the Future survey has been asking, strangely enough, high school seniors their opinions of overpopulation for about 30 years. And the share that say they're worried about overpopulation has declined over time.
So on sort of moving to another issue, one question is kind of how does the record, or what does the record show us about how policies in places like Poland and Hungary, or places like Australia and Canada, in terms of things like child allowances or baby bonds, what do we know about how successful or not these measures have been, and what do they tell us about potential solutions here in the U.S.?
All yours, Lyman.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's that last graph that I showed is pulling from every study I can find that provides an empirical estimate of an actual policy change, and the size of the effect you get from pronatal policy varies. And there's debate about the longevity of effects, but there is no credible academic debate at this point that if you throw money at babies, you will get more babies for at least a few years. You might not get more babies for the next 20 years, but you're going to get more babies for at least like 2 to 5 years. Now, the amount of money you have to spend is sometimes considerable. And some programs are much more expensive than others. So you have to spend a lot of money on childcare to get an increase in births. You do not have to spend a lot of money on a baby bonus to get an increase in births. Or I mean, you still do, but it's not as much. It does take a lot of money to try and boost fertility that way. It's not like super cost effective, but it can be done. And I should say, as Sam Hammond at the Niskanen Institute really likes to point out, if we valued the healthy life years of unborn children as much as we value the healthy life years of retirees, pronatal policy is a cheaper way to increase healthy life years. Even if you take the really pessimistic estimates, it's a cheaper way to increase healthy life years than Medicare is. Which is this, like, this gets into like some very kind of strange philosophical corners here, but if you really valued this abstraction of people who don't yet exist and adding their healthy life years to society, the cheapest way to boost healthy life years in society is probably pronatal policy, as expensive as it looks on its face.
Great. So Lori, I think this question might be for you. Did you guys look at the way in which religion might affect both workism and familism and fertility? Was there any kind of ancillary analyses you guys did on that question, or what would you sort of say about the religion angle here?
I'm really surprised we didn't.
I know, I'm suddenly thinking, how did we not? I looked at it a little bit in diffs, but I didn't look at it in ISSP or GFGS or IVS.
And I took a deep dive into the effect of religion on societal level gender equitable attitudes, without taking a deep dive into the effect of religion on workist and families. I like that idea. Do you like it, Lyman?
Yeah, it's kind of fun. I mean, yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, my assumption is that more religious people are probably more familist. I don't even know that I have an assumption about if more religious people would be more or less workist. I don't know.
I have a little bit of a, well, let's call it a sermonette for the sake of labeling it as preachy. But when I've been thinking about this question from a religious lens, particularly, when assigning it to my students as an extra credit forum that they can listen to, it's like, it's really easy for religious people to say, oh, it's good to value family over work. But I think there's a more subtle lesson for religious people here, not just that workism can interfere with fertility, which is often viewed as a positive end from a religious perspective, particularly a Catholic one. But again, I've thought about idolatry a lot and how familyolatry, while it can be conducive to fertility, is still not religion in the sense of worshiping God. And so I've thought a lot about these competing idols. And so religious folks may be relatively safe because part of living out the religion may be being good parents. So they can escape the low fertility trap. But it doesn't necessarily mean that their values are in the right places. They're just in more pro-fertile places.
So this one I actually did explicitly test in diffs, is because we get rank ordering of family and religion. So I can see who says family is more important than religion, right? And religion drives fertility and familism drives fertility, and they do it separately, and religion is bigger.
Okay.
That is the effect of like one rank order change in religion is in importance of religion is bigger than one rank order effect of the importance of family in diffs.
So, I guess we've kind of been assuming, throughout the course of our conversation tonight that this matters. And in fact, that it's in the main cause for concern, that so many countries are falling well below fertility. As I mentioned, South Korea is really, heading into sort of record territory here. And when you kind of talk about these issues with, a lot of people, policymakers, scholars, think tank leaders, often kind of, I got a blank look from them, like what's the big sort of, I can tell the thought in their head is, well, what's the big deal? Like, we can always rely upon immigrants, for instance, in the US to, to make sure that our economy is humming along, for instance. I mean, how do you respond to people who would sort of say that this isn't really a big deal, that we're seeing such dramatic declines in fertility? Like, why should we be concerned about it, from an economic or a social perspective, from a family perspective, or an individual perspective? Like, what are the key reasons that this dramatic decline would be cause for, for concern today?
I've gotten better at explaining in a few words the first half of my answer. The second half of my answer still needs work. So the immigration piece. So the first half of the answer, I think, can be if you visualize a generation of children that's smaller than the generation of adults. Then if you move forward in time, you've got a generation of retirees that's smaller than the labor force. That's grossly oversimplified, but it does help resonate with people who know things like that when Social Security was put into place in the United States, there were 8 workers per retiree. If you start thinking about less than 1 worker per retiree, or even 1, it's like, I don't think a 15% Social Security tax is really going to cut it. Wouldn't that have to be more like 100? And I'm not being serious about the numbers at all, but just trying to emphasize how much the age structure of the population matters for old age support. So I think I'm getting that across better than, oh, low fertility makes a population older. That's a little more abstract than a smaller number of workers, a bigger generation of retirees. The other thing that has been shown demographically, though, and Lyman, if you can help me with this, woohoo, but that I can't describe as well, is that the number of immigrants that it would take to basically fix the age structure of a place like South Korea is somewhere on the order of 2 billion. South Korea. I don't understand why it's that huge. I do know that immigration is not an easy fix, but I don't understand why the estimates are so wildly crazy that they can be dismissed as an answer.
So I don't know particularly that that calculation. What I would say, why is this a problem? When we think about social pathologies, right, things that are bad that we want to fix, there's 2 ways we can do it. And one is we can decide what social pathologies are, and we can go out and tell people, we're going to fix your problems. Often the result of this is that the people go, that's not my problem, right? You think that's a problem. I don't think it's a problem. The thing about low fertility is that policymakers are not doing anything about it, but the mass public does agree that this is a problem. People want 2 or 3 kids on average, and they're gonna have a lot less. So like, why do we care about this? We care about this if we believe in democracy at all. We care about this if we believe in any model of social problems other than like the philosopher king solves your problems for you, right? I'm thinking of like Easterly's sort of tyranny of experts line of reasoning, right? That we can either have this sort of centralized model of problem solving, or we can have a sort of democratized ground up model of problem solving. And so if we take that democratized model, then when we look for social problems, we should not be saying, what are the things that look like problems to the people in our society with the fewest problems, that is, wealthy people who make political decisions. Instead, we should be saying, what are the things that people identify as problems in their own life? Miscarriage, loneliness, isolation, family detachment. These are things pretty much everybody knows are problems. The only people who don't know their problems are people on Twitter and policymakers. These are like the only people in society who think these are not problems. So we just need to bypass them. So that's the first thing I'd say, is that we just have to have a different philosophical approach to identifying social problems. The second thing I would say is, look, I want higher immigration. I'm very pro-immigration. But we also have to recognize that regardless of various changes in immigration policy, the net rate of migration into the US has steadily declined for 30 years, and it's going to continue declining. There's nothing you can do about that. Because you know what's actually happening? Fertility rates are falling around the world. Meanwhile, more and more countries are facing this aging population problem, and they're opening up to immigrants. Japan is opening up, Korea is opening up, China's opening up. There's fewer immigrants, there's more competition for them. Immigration's great, love it, want more, all for it. It's not going to work. Also, inviting immigrants to move into a society where it's structurally impossible for that society to replace itself, when you know those immigrants are coming from societies with higher fertility preferences, is, I mean, yeah, they can come, but like saying we're not going to bother to fix the problem when you're inviting them in is like inviting people into a situation where you know their outcomes are unhappy. So that is not good treatment of those. That is not a welcoming treatment of immigrants, to be frank. So I'd say, yeah, bring more immigrants, whatever, great, love it. But in the meantime, we should probably deal with something that is rather obviously a social problem. And if it has economic effects, like I've written a lot about the economic effects, they're bad, but like that's kind of neither here nor there. If people want a worse economy 30 years from now, okay, let them have it. But the point is, people want to have bigger families than they're having.
I appreciate what Lyman's saying. Two things. One, a new thought to me tonight when he was talking about the immigrants with higher fertility preferences coming into our society, or any other workist society, those higher fertility preferences can get squeezed by workism, and then we lose some of the advantage that we were supposedly reaping. But the real thing I want to underline in what Lyman just said is, I talked at the societal level. Oh, we need workers per retiree. And he's like, individual people want children that they are not having. And that, I mean, even like you said, if you don't care about the economy or whatever, is still extremely important, just from the standpoint of people are not realizing their own goals. And again, the second demographic transition literature basically says, okay, women can, or people can have fewer kids to accommodate this bad situation, but let's make it more gender egalitarian so that they can have the kids that they want, so that people can actually achieve. Across Europe, the two-child family is pretty persistent norm. Couple places it's showing signs of erosion, but not severe erosion. It's people in rich countries don't usually want 5, but they do usually want 2, not that infrequently 3, and they're having 1.5 or 1.3 or 0.86 in South Korea. I'd be shocked if,
yeah, the average Korean woman wants 2.3.
I was going to say, I'd be shocked if it was even less than 1.8.
Yeah.
You're telling me it's 2.3, and she's having.
The average Japanese woman wants 2.5.
Yeah, and you know, we're demographers. We can talk about, you know, timing effects and how these numbers may not be precise. It doesn't matter if we ignore the tempo effects when you're talking about a gap of half a child or 6/10 of a child or whatever it is. It's huge. And so if we look at the 1994 International Conference for Population and Development in Cairo, Egypt, the whole idea of population and development as it was envisioned at that point is, let's empower women. That if women have job opportunities, if they have educational opportunities, if they have status and can make fertility choices, we are in a good place, because the rhetoric had gone from, oh, we got to slow down population for development, to, oh, we might not have to slow down population for development, to let's just take the focus off of that and focus on development as defined by Amartya Sen, when he said that development is about making choices. And so you empower people to make choices. Well, people are not empowered to have the kids that they want in today's low fertility situations, because of economic precarity, because of structures of childcare, because of workism, and probably 10 other things that I'm not mentioning. But if we could somehow address the primacy of work in life scripts, I mean, I'm encouraged by the fact that as people's income goes up, their leisure does. But that's obviously not enough to prevent people in the middle from not being able to have the kids that they want.
So do you all,
should we
do you
do like
all
a
think
lightning
that
round of
inequality-
questions?
Do you think that inequality per se, income inequality per se, is one of the factors that is driving workism? That people have some kind of recognition that, you know, there's a competition for themselves, for their kids in the broader economy that is getting, you know, more and more intense, and that makes them more inclined to kind of invest in the workplace to sort of secure their position, and less inclined to have kids. This question is referencing China maybe as an example of that in some ways. But anyways, do you have any thoughts? And so I'm trying to answer this question quickly, and I've got one more question after that, and we'll wrap it up.
My quick answer is that I doubt it, because I think a lot of the low fertility comes from folks whose jobs have been pinched, and sure, they want to work, but they're not caught in this careerism kind of thing. It's just that their jobs are outsourced. Those kinds of issues.
I'm a little more open to the idea, I guess. I think the status competition is the driving force of a lot of social, perhaps even biological evolution. As the status ladder gets longer, there's more rungs on it, it's plausible that people might change effort. But I don't know of any research on it off the top of my head. So, but.
So we know from, you know, some research that sort of technology and culture have combined in places like Brazil, for instance, to bring down the fertility rates. So kind of the introduction of TV combined with the telenovelas in Brazil seem to have had a measurable impact on fertility in Brazil, kind of pushing fertility down by promoting a kind of more, you know, luxurious lifestyle, so to speak. So the question that this person's kind of asking is, can we think about sort of relying on technology and culture to promote, you know, family life? And do you all think that some of these newer, you know, accounts online from people who are sort of streaming attractive family life, you know,
mommy bloggers,
little videos, the Mormon mommy bloggers would be an example of that. I mean, do you have any hope that that kind of thing would maybe make workism less high status, to use that frame of analysis, Lyman, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, my really brief answer would be that having a high status in parental influencers, let's be more neutral than mommy blogger, having a high status parental influencers and having it be that you can acquire status through parenting could be counter workist and might be the kind of thing that would work. However, I would caution that there is then a separate thing that you deal with, which is then parental anxiety. So one of our reviewers who we circulated our report to said, this is really interesting, but I think you really should think more about people's anxiety about not being a good parent. And so one of the problems you get is there's kind of a status treadmill with parenting, that on the one hand, it's like, oh, look at all this stuff. I'm such a great parent. I'm doing all these things. My Instagram has my kids wearing pastel colored bows in their hair that like I wove out of flower petals. I don't know. And it's like, oh, wow, you can be a high status mom or dad. Dads can be flower petals too. But only if you're like this crazy intense parent. Like the idea that you can be a high status parent, like sometimes you don't notice when your child climbs on the table and like maybe trips on it, like that's not high status parenting. And so I worry there's a bit of a trade-off there.
This is one
You can
place.
tell you can tell I read some parenting. I follow some influencers.
Sure.
I have a month-old.
Lori, any closing thoughts on this score?
Oh, just that Hollywood isn't really to blame for workism, I don't think. There are so many scripts that say, oh, person being a bad parent because they're spending too much time on their career. You know, the over career absorbed dad who hurts their child shows up a bunch of places, and the mom too. So
yeah, I actually think this is one where Hollywood repeatedly tells us families most, like in some sense, like Hollywood is kind of on our team on this one, that they repeatedly have narratives that are like the career obsessed person learns to like take a break. Like that's like the moral of the story. The problem is like the entire rest of culture has the opposite message.
So thank you everybody for attending tonight's lecture. We invite you to listen to this conversation or a past panel on the origin of the university on the IHE YouTube channel. Please also visit the website ihe.catholic.edu for more exciting events coming up. Tomorrow via Zoom at 2 p.m., the IHE is hosting a conversation with Dr. Michael Pekulik and Father Dwight Longenecker for the Feast of St. Joseph, entitled St. Joseph, Ordinary Holiness and the Renewal of Society. We hope to see you all there, and thank you again for your participation and questions this evening.